Reconsidering Victorian Britain and African America in the 19th century, neither Britain's soil nor its soul was as hardened by slavery as America's was, or at least not hardened in the same ways. Victorian England radiated a morality, a confidence, a commitment to reform and to social responsibility that a number of African Americans found appealing and inspiring. From England to Ireland, from the highest-ranking noble to the lowliest worker, the British comprised a people to be courted, respected, even emulated because the British were a people whom early 19th century African Americans perceived to be open. This is to say that when it came to black Americans, the British were more likely than white Americans to open their minds, their front doors, and their purses. The Victorianism, which appealed to white Americans, was twice as seductive for some of the more prominent African Americans who sought to advance their own people and culture. Britain may be said to have owned the 19th century, and a black leader such as Frederick Douglass was not adverse to British hegemony, as African Americans could look to Britain for some measure of moral, if not political intervention in plantation-minded America. The 20th century would see a shift in the position of Britain as the United States laid claim to the century. Indeed, as the 20th century progressed and the United States became the dominant world power, Victorian Britain, its culture, ideals, values, and beliefs, in short the Victorianism that served throughout the 19th century as a model for black and white America, certainly had its share of critics who denounced the Victorians and their ideas as puritanical, prudish, and hypocritical. As ascendancy shifted from Britain to the United States, conditions for blacks in America worsened, as lynching, segregation, and disenfranchisement became the order of the day, the most notable high point for black folk during this period proving to be the literary flowering called the Harlem Renaissance that took place between the two world wars. It would take the civil rights, black power, and black studies movements of the 1960s to establish African Americans as a political and cultural force around the world, influencing all post-slavery societies, as Steve Fenton, referencing Manning Marable's Race, Reform, and Rebellion, observes, Fenton 42. The Black Arts movement that complemented the Black Power movement turned to Africa instead of England and Europe for its inspiration. Not all, but many blacks, as a result of the new black aesthetic, eschewed things Eurocentric. In this rejection of Eurocentrism, the participants of the Black Arts movement of the 1960s differed from the artists of the Harlem Renaissance who tended to adopt the critical standards of Euro-American culture and to take as their ultimate point of reference the great tradition of Western European literary culture, one of the main tributaries of which was the Victorian Age of Britain, Mitchell IV. The artists associated with the Black aesthetic movement were more interested in exploring the distinctiveness of Black sensibilities, art, and culture. In the 1960s, playwright Adrian Kennedy proved to be one artist who, while exploring the distinctiveness of Black sensibilities, culture, and identity, insisted on its rootedness not only in Africa but also in Victorian England. In her 1964 one-act drama, Funny House of a Negro, the fragmented persona of Sarah, the black female around whom the play centers, appears on the stage not only as Patrice Lumumba, Jesus, and the Duchess of Habsburg but also as Queen Victoria who is, Sarah declares, my idol. In the play, Queen Victoria with her alopecia head of kinky hair, always wants me, Sarah, to tell her of whiteness. She wants me to tell her of a royal world where everything and everyone is white and there are not unfortunate black ones. In one Act 5, what Kennedy manages to convey to her audience in her autobiographically inspired drama is how Queen Victoria and Victorian culture are an important part of her identity as a black woman. Zalor's VA, among the list of fairy tale characters, movie stars, family members, and assortment of national, international, and local people who influenced the creation of plays such as Funny House. Kennedy would include the Victorian novelist Charlotte Bronte in her experimental autobiography, People Who Led to My Plays, 1987. Kennedy recalls how she read Jane Eyre and learned that life was to be a great journey, and it was a journey that would be spelled out with love, loyalty, devotion, loneliness, madness, sacrifice, and happiness, and that very life had been experienced by an English girl 1 century before. 14. Of the many English writers and characters she mentions in her autobio, not sign, graphical work, from Shakespeare to Queen Victoria, she makes repeated reference to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, who was sent away to boarding school just as Kennedy's mother had been as a 5-year-old. 36. Kennedy recounts how thrilled she herself was when she fulfilled the requirements of a drama class assignment by delivering a 10-minute monologue from Jane Eyre, the novel. Kennedy reminisces, "It was the only time in my life I publicly had a chance to become Jane Eyre. Even I could feel the passion I evoked in the class." 63. Near the end of People Who Led to My Plays, Kennedy, who later in life understood how powerfully she had connected to Jane Eyre the child, writes about rereading Charlotte again. She confesses that the Victorian novelist imbued in me a curiosity and love of the English moors, which I would finally see 20 years later on a rainy, misty July afternoon when I would tour Haworth and the Brontes' house with the English poet Adrian Mitchell. No place had ever quite captured my imagination as wildly as Yorkshire, as the winding streets of Haworth. 84, 110. Earlier on in her life, during trips down south to Montezuma, Georgia, Kennedy had discovered that her white ancestors had come from England, and she subsequently became very interested in England and in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, People Who 22. Her appreciation not only for such individuals as Haile Selassie, Tennessee Williams, and Richard Wright, but also for Percy Shelley, Winston Churchill, and especially Charlotte Bronte lends further support to the contention that Kennedy was interested in examining what Love Valerie King terms multi-ethnic origins, and that she did so at a time when other African American playwrights were making profound assertions of black pride in their works. 418. Clearly, in the work of a writer such as Kennedy, Victorian heritage was not eschewed. Still, during the period of the Black Arts Movement, most African Americans committed to celebrating the uniqueness and beauty of blackness may be said to have, like Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe, dropped the tribute to Victorian England Achebe, named for Victoria. 33. If, in the 1960s, a number of blacks, unlike playwright Adrian Kennedy, dropped the tribute to Victorian England, in the 1980s white neoconservatives would pick it up as part of a backlash that ushered in massive political reversals for people of color. Thus during the 1980s, when, as poet, essayist, and journalist Kevin Powell put it, Ronald Reagan then George Bush, the daddy, not the W, made things unsafe, spiritually, physically, psychologically, for the Negro everywhere. 1. Reagan's political counterpart in England, Margaret Thatcher, began, during an interview with British television journal, Not Sign, is Brian Walton, to enlist the idea of Victorian values in her 1983 campaign for re-election. 1. In the United States, Thatcher's references to Victorian and perennial values would find their expression in the phrase family values. And in, as cultural commentator Nelson George points out in Post Soul Nation, 2004, conservative calls for a return to traditional values, a phrase sure to worry any black person with a memory of America's racist traditions. 13. Federal cuts in spending for domestic programs, attacks on civil rights legislation and affirmative action indicated that the government in its Vic. Not sign. Tory-esque call for family values was no value of black families. As George remarks, accelerated erosion of government protections and the growing civic insensitivity to poverty. The enforcement of rigid rules governing programs and government spending would replace treatment of social ills, signaling that the government had indeed abandoned the struggle for equality for blacks. 1412. Although, as historian Robin D.G. Kelly reminds us in his foreword to Eric Mann's Dispatches from Durban, the 1980s also saw movements that emerged in opposition and created real challenges for the right. It remained a period of tremendous right-wing drift, capital flight, monopolization, unemployment, decline of urban communities, and state terror. VI. Although the neoconservative co-optation of Victorian values did not serve blacks well in the 1980s, by the 1990s, historian Gertrude Himmelfarb would, to her dismay, detect a new brand of Victorianism and a new breed of Victorians who seemed to serve blacks all too well. In what literary and cultural scholar Simon Joyce has described as a tendentiously Thatcherite diatribe, Himmelfarb expressed her fear that Victorianism was going awry, that it had fallen into the wrong hands. 5. Thus, according to Himmelfarb, the so-called New Victorians were a travesty of Victorianism, especially in their practice of a new, moralistic paternalism that sought the shift of responsibility from one individual to another. 260, 259, 262. So that, as she contends, in cases of rape or racial disputes, the new Victorian almost invariably places the burden of guilt upon the privileged or hegemonic person, the man rather than the woman, the white rather than the black. The individual thus functions not as an independent, responsible moral agent but as a surrogate for gender or race. 262. Clearly, Himmelfarb may be numbered among those conservative behaviorists whose projects, according to black cultural critic Cornel West in Race Matters, 1993, rest largely upon a cultural revival of the Protestant or Victorian work ethic in black America. 1112. Like the behaviorist West describes, Himmelfarb believes that blacks should not refer to their victimization. West 14. She also, in keeping with the behaviorist's approach, is given to talking about values and attitudes as if political and economic structures hardly exist. Rarely, if ever, examining the innumerable cases in which black people do act on the Protestant ethic and still remain at the bottom of the social ladder. West 13. That which is egregiously new and disturbing for Himmelfarb is the blackening of Victorianism, which had evolved in such a way that blackness and femaleness had been put at its center. The new Victorians, she was convinced, were mounting a counterattack against the white male, misconstruing Victorian virtues for modern values, and thereby contributing to the demoralization of society. More recently, black journalist Randall Robinson has also bemoaned the demoralization of society, or what he calls the unremarked disintegration of American democracy. 73. More specifically, he characterizes America as hypocritical, materialistic, and callous. dismissive of the cultural lifecraft of others, and incapable of providing spiritual sustenance. 98:23. Life for him as an African American has deteriorated to such a point that he has been forced, as with some of his Victorian age forebears, to quit America, but not, as it were, for Britain. For, instead of wishing to reclaim, as Himmelfarb does, Victorian the virtues of the age that bears her name, Robinson maintains that it is people like Queen Victoria who are the originators of the messes and crises that abound in the lives of many of the world's dark-skinned peoples. Robinson contends that the tortured black and brown of the earth have Queen Victoria, the Spanish conquistador, King Leopold, and all the other white-skinned heirs to Columbus to thank for the bloody turmoil that is Kashmir, the unsolvable dilemma that is the Middle East, the suffering that is Haiti, the political instability that is Africa, the lethal poverty that is Latin America, and the sickness of splintered identity that is Black America. 44. Because Queen Victoria heads this list of perpetrators, it is fair to assume that Robinson views Victorian Britain as powerful agents in the disempowerment and disadvantaging of brown and black peoples. Robinson's concern about an America that is becoming increasingly unlivable is anticipated in scholar Cornel West's identification of the most basic issue now facing Black America: the nihilistic threat to its very existence. Race Matters 12. Like Robinson, West attributes a portion of this nihilistic threat not only to the juggernaut of American materialism and greed but also to the weakening, if not the absolute breakdown of those cultural structures of meaning and feeling that sustained black folk and enabled them to cast out the demons of hopelessness, meaninglessness, and lovelessness. 15. Even though West does not denounce Queen Victoria as one of the conjurers of the demons that have beset blacks in America, he does not exactly discount the Queen or the constellation of values and ideas that have been attached to her name. West's reference to the role of Victoria and Victorian ideas in the lives of Black Americans, however, proves more nuanced. Thus, he recognizes, for example, the ways in which not only Victorian ideas, but even Victorian dress, empowered the great black thinker W.E.B. Du Bois, dignifying his sense of intellectual vocation, at the same time that he concedes how some of the ideas, values, and ethics that come out of Victorian Britain have militated against blacks in America. 40. Thus, in commenting on white American disgust with black sexuality, West observes, Victorian morality and racist perceptions die hard. 85. Now in this, the first decade of the 21st century, when events such as the September 11th, 2001, terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon in Washington, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the extreme polarization of political parties, and the failure of President George W. Bush and his administration to respond with anything resembling a sense of urgency to the mainly poor black victims of Hurricane Katrina, which devastated New Orleans in August 2005, herald exceptional tumult and upheaval. The relevance of the Victorians, who lived themselves in an age of turbulent change, abides, given the fact that, as critic Mary A. Jervin reminds us, the Victorian world was itself violently disruptive and divided sharply between two factions, the haves and the have-nots. The new millennial upheavals only strengthened identification of the millennial present with the Victorian past. 276. There is so little divarication that, as scholar J.O. Tate observes in a 1993 review of one of A.S. Byatt's neo-Victorian novels, the spirit of Ruskin, the ghost of the younger Arnold, the shade of Dickens, These and many others hover about our heads when we think of the contradictions of capitalism, the disintegration of culture, and our responsibilities at home and abroad. 60. One critic, who also recognizes how events such as the terrorist attacks of September 11th brought into popular consciousness the long and largely Victorian history of the great game of empire, advises that we may begin to suspect how far we haven't come in 100 years, that we appeal to Victorian culture in order to think about problems and needs that are not wholly unprecedented. Kruger Z.I. The Victorians have by no means been left behind. To a growing chorus of cultural critics argue that the world can hardly not sign the gate from, let alone dispense with, Victorian Britain. Thus, scholars John Cockett and Diane F. Sadoff in Victorian Afterlife, 2002, contend that the explosion of postmodern Victoriana coincides with what scholar Nancy Armstrong in her postscript to the volume calls the Victorian boom in culture criticism. Postmodernism, which the editors of Victorian Afterlife as not sign cert fetishizes notions of cultural emergence, has identified the 19th century as a site of origin and rupture, a moment of emergence XV 312 in functions of Victorian culture at the present time. 2002. Editor Christina Kruger claims, in our society at large, Victorian culture has probably never been more popular and influential. X3. In the preface to yet another edition on both the recuperative value and, to borrow Peter Fryer's expression, the staying power of the Victorians, scholar Sylvia K. Perel-Bizzini declares in We, the Other Victorians, 2003, the end of the last century and the beginning of the new one have not brought with them a new way of looking at the world. Instead, they have reinterpreted, and proposed the most conservative values of Victorianism. 14. Perel-Bizzini goes on to explain how the volume she has edited demonstrates how the heritage of Victorian thought is still alive, and furthermore shows how we, the other Victorians, have used that thought not only to forge hegemony, but also to construct counter-hegemonic discourses and discourses of resistance. 16. Cultural critics such as Cockett and Sadoff, Kruger, and Perel-Bizzini acknowledge the various ways in which Victorian culture continues to inform our world, our ethics, politics, psychology, and art. Kruger The works of these critics indicate that in the 21st century, the heritage and the legacy of Victorian Britain remains essential and constitutive. Victorian-infused politics, social policies, psychology, hegemony, and counter-hegemony affect blacks, a historically devalued group living in a nation the Anglophilia of which is largely predicated upon England and its Victorian era. As black cultural critic Michael Eric Dyson comments in his Reader, 2004, England remains a place America still cowers before intellectually. 507. The point to be made here is that England, especially the England of the Victorians, whether for good or for bad, still matters for black folk in America. Victorian England, its culture, and its values are contemporized in the lives of African Americans, whether as contested family values or as an ethos of moral responsibility that places the burden of modern social ills on the white paternalistic structures that directly or indirectly engineered them. The struggle for blacks remains the very struggle Black Arts Movement leader Addison Gale, Jr., described when he admonished black folk, as African American Studies professor Nathaniel Normand, Jr., restates it, not to allow themselves to be degraded, dismissed, and devalued as black persons, shedding dignity and cultural identity in an effort to forge themselves into the round, gaping abyss of an Americanization, that is, I should add, the successor to British imperialism. 372. Part of the continued efforts of blacks to fend off the forces of denigration will hinge on an understanding of the Victorian age, of how it is implicated in both hegemonic and counter-hegemonic discourse, and of how it may provide insight, for instance, into some of the persistent and negatively racialized ideas about black sexuality and black criminality. For, as cultural scholar Gary Day argues, Victorian values have never ceased to be a shaping force throughout the 20th century. Because Victorian values have never gone away, different ones have merely been emphasized, at different times, too. These values show no signs of waning in the 21st century, for that matter. Neither has the African American culture W.E.B. Du Bois showcased alongside British Victorian culture in the last chapter of The Souls of Black Folk Gone Away. Even though the Victorians and their culture have remained a shifting and changing force in the lives of African Americans have also been having their cultural say. In fact, certain aspects of African American culture have become as formidable a shaping force as that of Victorian Britain, especially among today's youth. Thus, in Frontlines and Backyards, Black British cultural critic Stuart Hall explains that a distinctive feature of the new Black British identity is the extent to which it has been Americanized. Its ideal images, its stylistic reference are very powerfully Black American, even though the style may have been indigenized. Given a British homegrown stamp, all the leads come from Afro-America. 129. In a similar vein, Black cultural journalist Greg Tate in Everything But the Burden, 2003, notes, the impact of African American music and musical culture on white British and American notions of masculinity and style plays no small role in accounting for the largely white male and Japanese fandoms of jazz, blues, rock and roll, soul, funk, reggae, and now hip-hop. 9. Indeed, as Tate goes on to comment, the black body, and subsequently black culture, has become a hungered-after taboo item, not only in the badlands of the American racial imagination, but in Britain and, I dare say at the risk of making what Paul Gilroy calls one of those easy claims of African American exceptionalism, Gilroy 4, in the world. Still as widely influential as African American culture has become, its dissemination is problematic because it remains the culture of a people envied but reviled. The hungered after taboo item is also, we are informed, a nightmarish bugbear. G. Tate 4. The story of the spread of African American culture, particularly African American popular culture, is the story, according to Black historian Manning Marable, of cultural interaction without understand, not sign-ing, or semi-acculturation. Marable writes, with the legal desegregation of America's cultural and social institutions after the 1960s, white Americans absorbed critical elements of African American music, dance, literature, language, and artistic expression. They accepted black participation in professional athletics, and extended acclaim to African American film stars and entertainers. But their affinity and tolerance for blackness were almost always cultural and ethnic, rather than racial. Young whites have learned to mimic African American music and singing styles, but they might vote against a black candidate for public office solely on racial grounds. 190. What Marable does here is describe how, in effect, America has skinned, if not filleted African American culture and then, in the words of Tate, sold it to the world as uniquely American in character. 3. African American culture today is commodified, exported, and consumed, and in a way that Victorian culture never was. Be that as it may, the correspondence between Victorian Britain and African America remains viable. The two cultures are no more separate than they were a century ago. For, regardless of whether the culture and ideas associated with Victorian Britain and African America are pitted against one another as they have been since the 1980s, or whether they are paired as they were by Du Bois at the turn of the 20th century, the two still survive as assemblages, to borrow Gilroy's expression, that continue to speak to each other and to resonate in the world. 1. In doing so, Victorian Britain and African America continue to share a bond forged in the desires, efforts, and thoughts of individual British Victorians and African Americans who dreamed of a world that could be.